Kregon's Dark World presents the archive of fucked up futures, the basement of broken dreams. This shithole town was a cancer on the face of the earth, a festering wound that refused to heal. And in its rotten core, a library stood like a decrepit monument to the damned. The building was a disaster, its walls held together by duct tape, prayers, and the sheer force of desperation. But, like all things in this fucked up world, it had a secret. A secret that was hidden in the basement, where the air reeked of mildew, forgotten dreams, and the stench of rotting souls. It was here that a group of brain-dead friends stumbled upon an archive of books that would change their lives forever. The books were old, their covers worn and faded, but the words within were as fresh as the blood that would soon be spilled. And man, was it going to be a bloodbath. As they delved deeper into the archive, they discovered that each book was written by a resident of this godforsaken town. But with a twist, they had never written them. The books detailed their life stories, but with a terrifying accuracy that predicted their futures, including their deaths. Yeah, it was some creepy shit. One of the friends, a petite blonde named Sarah, opened a book with her name on it. As she read, her eyes widened with horror. The book described her death in graphic detail. She would be brutally murdered by a serial killer who would rape her corpse and leave her body to rot in a ditch. The killer would then take a selfie with her lifeless body, captioning it, "Just another Tuesday on Instagram." "Fuck, this is some sick shit," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm gonna be a hashtag on some psycho's Instagram." Another friend, a tall, lanky guy named Jake, found a book that predicted his death in a car crash. The book described how his body would be crushed beyond recognition, his brain splattered on the pavement like a Jackson Pollock painting. The cherry on top? The car's GPS would still be giving directions, saying recalculating as Jake's lifeless body slumped over the steering wheel. "This is some hardcore shit," Jake said, his voice laced with a mix of fascination and terror. "I'm going to be a human pancake." As they continued to read, they realized that the books were not just predicting their deaths, but also manipulating their futures. The choices they made would alter the course of their lives, leading them down a dark path of destruction and chaos. It was like they were trapped in a choose-your-own adventure book, but with more gore and less happy endings. The group's dynamics began to shift as they started to turn on each other. Sarah became convinced that Jake was the serial killer mentioned in her book, and she started to plot her revenge. She began to secretly follow him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jake, on the other hand, started to experience strange visions, as if the book was seeping into his mind. Saw himself crashing his car, feeling the impact of the crash, and hearing the sound of his own screams. "Fuck, what's happening to me?" he exclaimed, his voice laced with panic. "Am I going crazy, or is this book just messing with my head?" As the group's situation continued to deteriorate, they realized that they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence and death. The books had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they were powerless to stop it. They were pawns in a twisted game, and the only way to win was to die in the most creative and violent way possible. The basement seemed to grow darker, the air thickening with an eerie presence. It was as if the books were alive, feeding off their fear and chaos. The group could feel the weight of the book's malevolent energy, crushing them beneath its oppressive yoke. And in the midst of this chaos, the group stumbled upon a mysterious figure, hidden in the shadows. A figure who seemed to be pulling the strings, manipulating their fate. "Welcome to the archive, you pathetic little shits," Kregon said, his voice dripping with sadistic pleasure. "I've been waiting for you. You see, I've been collecting these books for years, and I've been waiting for the perfect group of idiots to come along and play out their own twisted stories. As Kregon spoke, the group realized that they were trapped in a twisted game of survival, where the only way to win was to die in the most creative and violent way possible. And Kregon would be there, watching and waiting as they played out their own twisted stories in an endless cycle of violence and death. But here's the twist, Kregon said, his eyes gleaming with malevolence. You're not just characters in a book. You're not just pawns in a game. You're the authors of your own demise. You're the ones who wrote these books, predicting your own deaths and manipulating your own futures. The group's minds reeled as they tried to comprehend the twisted truth. They were the ones who had written their own deaths, predicting their own futures, and manipulating their own destinies. They were the authors of their own demise, trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence and death. It's a hell of a dark world, Kregon whispered, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. And you're the ones who created it. As the group's screams echoed through the basement, Kregon laughed maniacally, his voice echoing through the darkness like a chorus of damned souls. The archive of fucked up futures had claimed another group of victims, trapping them in a never-ending cycle of violence and death. And Kregon would be there, watching and waiting, as they played out their own twisted stories in an endless cycle of horror and despair. But the question remained, if they were the authors of their own demise, could they change their own fate? Could they rewrite their own stories and escape the cycle of violence and death? Or were they forever trapped in the hell of their own creation,